taken from the 21st chapter of Luke. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." And they asked him, "Teacher, when will this be, and what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." And then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs upon heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons. You'll be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You'll be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." And that's the reading. Last week, as I was preparing for this sermon, I couldn't get an old song by the 1980s rock group REM out of my mind, one that was called "It's the End of the World as We Know It." Now, when you listen to it, if you've ever listened to it, the lyrics come at you so rapid fire that they're pretty much impossible to follow, at least for me. And so I Googled them, and here's what I found. Among the still timely and relevant themes being explored in that song are the following: rampant nationalism, governments run amok, the news media, personal selfishness, and of course, naturally, the end of the world. These days, with our Congress and the entire country so sharply divided over the impeachment hearings currently going on in Washington, D.C., and the startling and frightening effects that climate change is apparently having on our planet and the environment, not to mention the ongoing political unrest in the Middle East, it's probably not too much of a stretch to wonder if, in fact, this is indeed the end of the world, that perhaps we are living in the so-called end times. But when you stop and think about it, predicting the end of the world has pretty much been around about as long as the world itself, at least human history. For example, if you go online and Google the end of the world, here's just a sampling of what you'll get. The first prediction of the end was actually made during the 1st century. The Essenes, a Jewish sect, saw the Jewish revolt against the Romans in 66 to 70 AD as the final end-time battle before the arrival of the Messiah. And sure enough, it certainly must have seemed like it to them after the massive death and destruction that accompanied this futile revolt, including the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which was burned to the ground. But as it turns out, they were only the first to get it wrong. 3 theologians, Hippolytus of Rome, Sextus Julius Africanus, and Irenaeus, all prophesied the second coming of Christ, and with it the end of the world in the year 500 AD. One of them supposedly based his prediction on the dimensions of Noah's Ark. 500 years later, in the year 1000, Pope Sylvester II predicted the so-called millennium apocalypse. Riots broke out all across Europe as pilgrims headed east to Jerusalem. In 1524, Johannes Stauffer, a respected German mathematician and astrologer, predicted that a great flood would cover the earth on February the 25th, when all the known planets would be in alignment under Pisces, a water sign. Hundreds of pamphlets announcing this coming flood were even printed and distributed, and they set in motion a general panic. A guy by the name of Count von Igelheim, a German nobleman, even went so far as to build for himself a 3-story ark. But alas, even though light rain fell on the day of the predicted flood, no actual flooding ever materialized. A religious leader named William Miller began preaching in 1831 that the end of the world as we know it would occur with the second coming of Christ again, which he said would take place in 1843. And he ultimately attracted as many as 100,000 followers who all believed that they would be carried off into heaven when that day arrived. When the 1843 prediction failed to come true, however, Miller recalculated and then determined that the world would actually end in 1844. But unfortunately, that year came and went as well without the second coming. I guess he calculated wrong. And then there was Henry Armstrong, the founder of the Worldwide Church of God, who told the members of his church that the rapture would take place in 1936 and that only they would be saved. But when 1936 came and went, he changed the date to 1943, and then 1972, finally 1975, and he died in 1986 with his end of the world prophecy batting average at 0 for 4. Cult leader Charles Manson, some of you may recall, predicted an apocalyptic race war that would bring about the end in 1969. He apparently based his prediction on a Beatles album. Even mainstream religious leaders like Pat Robertson of the 700 Club and Jerry Falwell got into the end times prophecy business as well. Robertson said that it would be in 1982. During a broadcast of the 700 Club, he said, "I guarantee you that by October or November of 1982, there's going to be a judgment on the world." Falwell, to his credit, gave himself a little more leeway and said it would take place sometime between 1999 and 2009. Oh well, they tried at least. Robertson later acknowledged, "I have a relatively good track record," he said, "but sometimes I miss," apparently. Well, we can't forget Harold Camping, who first predicted that the end would come on September the 6th, 1994, and then September the 29th, October the 2nd, finally March 31st, 1995. And after that, Camping went out of the end times prediction business until 2011, when he said that it would occur on May 21st. And when that didn't happen either, he said that it would be October 21st, meaning that he beat Henry Armstrong's 0 for 4 with an 0 for 6 of his own. And then, of course, there was the Y2K scare associated with January the 1st, 2000 that also came and went. And, of course, there was a supposed Mayan apocalypse that some said would take place on December the 21st, 2012, when the Earth would be destroyed by an asteroid or some other interplanetary object, maybe an alien invasion or perhaps a supernova. They never could quite figure it out, except to say that the ancient Mayans must have known something because their long count calendar ended on that precise day. But who knows? Maybe they just got tired of counting up so high. My point is simply this: throughout history, there's been no shortage of end-of-the-world predictions, not to mention those who make them, as well as people all too willing to believe them. In all, I counted over 150 of these end-of-the-world predictions throughout history during my brief online research, not including multiple predictions by the same people, as we've already seen. And yet none of them came true, did they? In Martin Luther's day, it was the plague that got people thinking that maybe it was the end times. And now, just the other day, I saw the following headline: 2 people got the plague in China. Yes, the Black Death plague, it said. But today it's also the threat of other pandemics like the Ebola virus, for instance, or the possibility of nuclear annihilation, or again, the catastrophic effects of climate change. The list is seemingly endless. Every generation, in fact, pretty much every single one, fears that they might be living in the end times. And so far, at least, despite all these fears, the end has still not yet come. Well, the end of the world was also undoubtedly on the minds of the people that Jesus was talking with in this evening's gospel reading. And to put this moment into context and to give us some perspective, this exchange took place during Holy Week. In other words, tensions were already running high, and more than a few people were probably wondering what was about to happen. The scene was set, you see, for a big classic showdown between Jesus on the one hand and the religious leaders in the Roman Empire on the other. Maybe this is when and how it's all going to come to an end, some of them were perhaps speculating. And so here we are. Luke tells us at the beginning of chapter 21 that Jesus had come to teach at the temple. And after handling all the trick questions thrown at him by the chief priests and the scribes and the Sadducees, including whether or not it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar, and whose wife in heaven would a woman be who had been married to a series of brothers in this life, he also apparently responded to those who were admiring the temple itself, specifically how it was adorned with such beautiful stones. And as we heard, Jesus said to them, "All this splendid stonework and craftsmanship you're admiring so much, well, here's the thing," he said. "The time is coming when every stone in that building will end up in a heap of rubble." And with that, he had their attention, didn't he? This sure sounds like end times stuff, they must have been thinking to themselves. And so they said to him, "Teacher, when is this going to happen? When will this be? What sign or clue will we receive to tell us that this is about to take place?" And Jesus answered them with words just as relevant today in our own time as they were back then in the first century. He said, beware of those who come to you saying that they know when the end of the world is going to take place, claiming, I'm the one, the time is near, listen to me. Please, he said, don't fall for any of that. And when you hear about wars and uprisings, don't panic. These things are going to happen, but they're not a sign of the end, not in and of themselves. Now granted, he said, nations will fight against other nations, and kingdoms will come and go, over and over again, in fact. And there'll even be earthquakes and famines and plagues. You'll look around and see all kinds of things, and be absolutely convinced that these are the telltale signs that the end has indeed arrived. But it hasn't. It's as if Jesus was saying to them way back then, and also to us today as well, don't worry, trust me. God is the one in control, and only God will determine when the end will come. A Major League umpire once called the great slugger Babe Ruth out on strikes. And when the crowd booed loudly to express their disapproval and displeasure, the legendary Ruth turned to this umpire with disdain and said, there are 40,000 people here who know that that last pitch was a ball, tomato head. And anticipating the umpire would in turn erupt with anger himself, everyone in the stadium, coaches, players, fans alike, all braced themselves for Ruth's certain ejection from the game. Instead, however, the umpire kept his cool, and he calmly replied, maybe so, babe, but mine is the only opinion that counts. And likewise, when it comes to the end of the world and when that might actually occur, the only and one and only opinion that counts is God's. Notice, though, that Jesus doesn't stop there. He goes on, but this much I can tell you, he said. This much is true. You'll be hounded and persecuted on account of me and because of my name. In fact, this persecution will come at you from every angle, sometimes even from those closest to you. There's no telling who will hate you because of me. During the 1920s, the Russian dictator Joseph Stalin ordered a purge of all Bibles and believers. In one place, a city named Stavropol, this order was carried out meticulously and completely. Thousands of Bibles were confiscated, and thousands of people were rounded up and sent away to the gulags, in other words, labor camps, where many of them died because they were considered enemies of the state. About 20 years ago, however, some Christians were actually allowed to visit Stavropol, and they didn't know anything about the history of the city at the time, but when they had difficulty getting Bibles shipped in from Moscow, someone mentioned that they knew of a warehouse that existed where these confiscated Bibles had been stored ever since Stalin's time. And the team of Christians prayed together, and one member of the group had the courage to go to that warehouse and to ask the officials if the Bibles still stored there could be removed and distributed once again to the people of Stavropol. And surprisingly, the answer was yes. And so the next day, the rest of the team returned with a truck and several Russians that they had hired to help them. And one of these helpers was a young man, a skeptical, hostile, agnostic university student who couldn't care less about Christianity, but came along only for the day's wages. And later, as they were loading the Bible, someone noticed that this student had disappeared. And so they went looking for him, and they finally found him in a corner of the warehouse weeping, while holding one of these old Bibles that had been stored there since the days of Stalin and the persecution of Stavropol's Christians back in the 1920s. You see, when he had picked up one of the Bibles, he just happened to glance at the inside page where its previous owner had written her name. And there he had found the signature of his own grandmother.
Oh.
Someone who had been persecuted for her faith by some of her own neighbors, surely perhaps even by some of her own family members. They'd taken away her Bible and sent her away to the labor camps, all because of her faith and her willingness to confess and not deny it. And now, some 70 years later, her own grandson had found that very same Bible, her personal Bible. And it had moved this unbeliever to tears as he contemplated, perhaps for the very first time, how much she had sacrificed and suffered for her faith. They will arrest you and persecute you, said Jesus, hand you over to the authorities and put you in prison because you carry my name. But then Jesus said a second thing. This will give you an opportunity to testify. This will give you a chance to tell others who I am. But don't worry. I'll give you the words to say, no matter what happens, know this, I'll be with you. Even the hairs on your head will be in my care, and you will be saved. We live in unsettling times, for sure. Perhaps scary times, even. But so did those who've gone before us, especially those who've gone before us in the faith, and stood firm, even when the world around them seemed to be coming apart at the seams. They stood firm and faithful. They lived out their faith, and it's because of them that we're even here today, free to live out that very same faith. And now it's our time to stand firm and faithful, ready to testify to our faith. Scott Hosey had it right, I think, when he observed, in the end, Jesus is not interested in telling us precisely what the future holds, but rather who holds the future. And when you know who holds the future, then you know who holds your every moment in the present time as well, he said. What really matters is that God is in control. God will determine our future. God will be with us no matter what happens in our world or what pain and struggles we might have to face. And that in turn is the basis of our hope in the future. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who survived the death camps of Nazi Germany. And afterwards, Frankl made a startling discovery about why some survived these horrible conditions and some did not. He looked at a number of factors: health, vitality, family structure, intelligence, even survival skills. And finally, however, he concluded that it was none of these factors. The single most significant factor, he realized, was a sense of hope. Those who were able to survive all felt they had a mission yet to perform, some important work left to do. Norman Cousins, in his book, Head First, The Biology of Hope, similarly illustrates the power of hope. He tells of two physicians who were to deliver a paper at a national meeting of cancer specialists. And one was truly perplexed. "I don't understand it, Bob," he said. "We use the same drugs, the same dosage, and the very same schedule of treatments, and yet I get a 22% recovery rate, and you get a 74% recovery rate. How do you explain that?" And the other doctor responded, "We both use etoposide, platinol, oncovin, and hydroxyurea. Now you put these letters together and tell people that you're giving them EPOH, whereas I put them together and explain to them that they're receiving HOPE, hope. I emphasize to them that with hope, they have a chance." We live in a crazy, mixed-up world, there's no doubt about it. And it's a world that requires good people, especially good people of faith, to be a beacon of hope, to stand up for that faith and for what it teaches us. That we need to love and care for and respect every single human being, not just in our own country, but in the entire world. That we need to work tirelessly to promote and defend liberty and freedom and the right of every single individual on this planet to have access to adequate food and health care and education. That we need to fight injustice and hatred and prejudice anywhere and everywhere we see it. And that we need to dream of a world where God's peace will bring an end to every hostility and will become the guiding light and principle for how we all live and coexist on this planet. Is it the end of the world as we know it, like in that old REM song? Maybe the key words here are "as we know it." Maybe this is the end of the world as we currently know it, but only because God in Christ is calling us to a better world and a better life. And it's this better world and better life to come that gives us our hope in the future. Let us pray. Oh God, you've called